Imagine two people earning the same income, living in the same city, facing the same prices for rent, groceries, and transportation. On the surface, their financial lives look almost identical, yet the way they experience money day to day can feel completely different. One of them checks their bank account before every purchase, hesitates before paying a bill, and feels a quiet tension whenever an unexpected expense appears. The other still budgets carefully, but decisions feel calmer and more deliberate. The difference between these two situations is often not a dramatic jump in wealth or income, but the presence of a relatively small financial buffer. Around a certain point, usually somewhere near a $5,000 reserve, something subtle begins to change in the way people interact with money. This number is not magical, and it varies depending on location, cost of living, and personal obligations. However, behavioral economists and financial psychologists have observed that once people move from having almost no liquid savings to having a modest cushion, their decision-making patterns begin to shift. The change is not only mathematical, it is psychological. Without any financial buffer, every expense carries immediate consequences. A car repair, a medical bill, or even a slightly higher electricity bill can push the monthly balance into negative territory. Because the margin is so thin, attention becomes focused on short-term survival. This environment naturally encourages reactive decision-making. People become more sensitive to immediate costs and less able to consider long-term trade-offs. This is not a personal failure or lack of discipline. It is a predictable response to scarcity. Researchers studying scarcity psychology often describe how limited resources narrow cognitive bandwidth. When financial pressure is constant, a large portion of mental energy is devoted to monitoring balances, tracking upcoming bills, and avoiding overdraft situations. The brain prioritizes immediate stability, which makes long-term financial planning more difficult. Even small decisions begin to feel heavier because the consequences are so close to the surface. Now consider what happens when a small financial buffer exists. $5,000 does not remove financial risk. It does not create wealth in the traditional sense, but mathematically it introduces something extremely important into the system: time. A financial buffer extends the number of days or weeks someone can respond to an unexpected problem before it becomes a crisis. To see this more clearly, imagine a sudden $1,000 expense. For someone with only a few $100s available, the expense immediately creates a chain reaction. Credit cards may be used, bills might be delayed, or essential spending may be reduced. Each of those responses can create additional costs later through interest charges, fees, or missed opportunities. The problem expands beyond the original $1,000. For someone holding a modest $5,000 reserve, the same expense still matters, but the response can be different. The payment can be absorbed while leaving some remaining cushion. Instead of scrambling to rearrange every financial obligation, there is space to plan how the buffer will be rebuilt over the next several months. The difference between those two reactions may not seem dramatic on paper, yet it changes the rhythm of financial life. The mathematical reason behind this shift is surprisingly simple. When a system has no margin, even small disturbances create instability. Engineers often describe this principle when designing structures or networks. A bridge, for example, is never built to hold only the exact weight expected to cross it. Additional capacity is always included because real-world conditions introduce uncertainty. Personal finances operate in a similar way. A $5,000 buffer acts as a small shock absorber within the financial system of an individual household. It does not eliminate volatility, but it reduces the speed at which problems escalate. Because the escalation slows down, decision-making can become more measured. People gain the ability to pause, evaluate options, and choose responses that minimize long-term damage. Another effect begins to appear at this stage. Once financial emergencies stop happening every few weeks, attention gradually shifts away from crisis management towards stability. Instead of constantly asking how to survive the next bill cycle, people start asking different questions. They might consider whether a particular expense truly adds value, whether a subscription is necessary, or whether extra income should rebuild the buffer rather than increase spending. This shift is subtle but powerful because identity begins to change alongside behavior. Individuals who previously felt trapped in a reactive cycle start to see themselves as managers of a financial system rather than victims of unpredictable expenses. The external circumstances may still be challenging, yet the internal relationship with money becomes more analytical and less emotional. Historical patterns in personal finance show that many long-term improvements begin with exactly this kind of margin, not large investments, not complex strategies, but simply the presence of a small reserve that prevents financial shocks from triggering cascading consequences. Once that reserve exists, people often make slightly better decisions repeatedly over time, and those small improvements gradually reshape their financial trajectory. It is important to recognize that building such a buffer can be difficult, particularly in environments where wages, housing costs, and healthcare expenses leave very little room for savings. The concept of a $5,000 threshold should not be interpreted as a universal rule or a guarantee of stability. Instead, it represents a useful illustration of how financial systems respond when even a small amount of margin is introduced. The key idea is that money does more than purchase goods and services. In many cases, it purchases time, flexibility, and cognitive clarity. When financial pressure decreases slightly, the mind gains the space needed to think beyond immediate problems. That change in perspective often becomes the starting point for more deliberate financial behavior. Over long periods, the compounding effect of calmer decisions can matter far more than dramatic income changes. A person who consistently avoids emergency borrowing, late fees, and impulsive reactions gradually preserves more of their resources. Meanwhile, someone operating without margin may repeatedly lose small amounts of money through urgent decisions that seemed necessary at the time. Viewed through this lens, the $5,000 buffer is less about the number itself and more about the structural change it introduces. It represents the moment when a financial system moves from constant fragility toward modest resilience. The difference may not appear dramatic in a spreadsheet, but in daily life it can transform how money is experienced. In the end, financial stability rarely arrives all at once. It tends to emerge gradually as systems become slightly more robust and decision-making becomes slightly more thoughtful. A small buffer does not solve every problem, yet it often creates the breathing room necessary for better choices to accumulate over time. And within the quiet mathematics of personal finance, that margin can quietly change everything about the way people think, plan, and move through their financial lives.